Well, good evening again, and thank you for coming. I'm Kimberly Ferguson. I'm the president of the United Methodist student group, the Wesley Foundation here on campus, and also a member of the Interfaith Council. And it's my great pleasure tonight to present Reverend David Fracaro. He is a recent graduate of Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University in New York City, where he focused on religion and human rights. Reverend Fracaro most recently served as the Young Adult Ecumenical Formation Coordinator for the National Council of Churches and the U.S. Conference for World Council of Churches, as well as the Coordinator for Sojourners Visitation Program with detained immigrants and asylum seekers out of the Riverside Church in New York City. This program helped inspire a recent independent film, The Visitor. David is an ordained minister with the United Church of Christ, formerly serving 2 UCC churches in New Jersey, while also representing the UCC at the United Nations. David has worked internationally on issues related to human rights and conflict resolution in Bolivia, Kenya, and East Timor. In addition, he has worked with United Caring Shelters for the Homeless in Evansville, Indiana, and has volunteered with the Council of American Indians Ministries of the UCC in rural Oklahoma, and also with the No More Deaths on the Arizona-Mexico border. After living 10 years in New York City, David has recently relocated to Chicago, where he is an outreach and education trainer with the Interfaith Youth Corps. The Interfaith Youth Corps' mission is to build religious pluralism through higher education. David spent this afternoon helping to train and empower students and members of the Ames community with the tools and skills to be effective in promoting religious pluralism and positive interfaith cooperation in our community. I would like to thank the Wesley Foundation, the Interfaith Council, Religious Leaders Association, and the Committee on Lectures for making this event possible. And please join me in welcoming Reverend David Fracaro.
Well, thank you, Kimberly. And to all the folks who made my visit possible. It's a privilege for me to be able to be here in Ames and to talk to all of you. You're spending an hour of your life right now listening to me, and I appreciate that and hope someday that I'll be sitting down listening to you. I'd actually heard that for some students, this is actually a requirement for class. So if you wouldn't be so shy as to raise your hand if this is legitimately a requirement and you have to be here. Don't be shy, that's fine. Yeah, good. No shame. We're going to try to make this as exciting as possible and make this a memorable hour in your life. I want to begin by telling a story, my story of religious pluralism. I was raised in a small town in Indiana and went to junior high and high school in a place called Paradise, Indiana. Ironically enough, Paradise wasn't particularly diverse, particularly religiously. So you can imagine what kind of a shock it was for me to move to New York City to be a starving actor. One of the benefits of being a starving actor is that you don't actually get to live in Manhattan because it's way too expensive. So you live in one of the boroughs, and I lived in Queens. And Queens is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the entire world. And so it took me about a year and a half until I started actually reaching out and feeling comfortable amongst this new diversity that I found myself in. I had Tibetan neighbors. I had Croatian neighbors, neighbors from Trinidad and Tobago and from West Africa. And it took me about a year and a half to start to embrace that diversity in all its ethnicity, in all its cultural diversity and religious diversity. And then 9/11 happened. I was actually at an audition that morning in Manhattan, a couple of miles north of the Twin Towers, and caught one of the last trains back into Queens. And I remember the first stop off once you get into Queens over the East River, you're at the Queensboro Bridge, which overlooks all of Manhattan, and you have such a beautiful vision of the entire island of Manhattan, and particularly Lower Manhattan. And I remember always seeing the Twin Towers skying above everything else, and we all remember what a clear, beautiful day that was. I remember coming out of that tunnel up into the bridge and seeing both towers on fire now. And I remember watching and just feeling this emptiness in my gut. And all of a sudden, a train across the tracks came, so I couldn't quite see the towers anymore. And right as that train left, about 30 seconds later, one of the towers was completely gone. And what was left was this huge cloud of smoke engulfing the entire lower half of Manhattan. Later that night, for comfort, many people in the neighborhood went to the local Irish pub. And there I heard a lot of mixes of emotions that I myself was feeling. Sadness mixed with anger, and even a little bit of hatred. And so a lot of comments were coming out of that pub, like those damn Muslims. We should round up all of the immigrants and kick them out. And if I'm going to be honest with you, that part of me that felt resentful kind of found myself, a little part of myself, agreeing with that. And the next day, I got on a subway train. They weren't going back into Manhattan, but they were still going around Queens. And Manhattan and Queens at that time was almost like it felt like a ghost town, so there was hardly anybody on the subway train that day. And I got on, except for a Muslim woman in hijab, the headscarf that you'll see Muslim women wearing sometimes. She was about 5 seats away from me. And so I sat down, and right after I sat down, I looked down to the empty seat next to me, and scrawled in knife marks were the words, "All Muslims must die." And instinctually, I just started to scooch over because I didn't want the woman to see that. And so I started scooching over, and right as I did, she caught my eyes, and she knew exactly what I was trying to do. And she looked at me with the same kind of confusion and heartbreak and anger and resentment that I had been feeling over the last day. And so we just caught eyes. And I didn't have a clue as to what to say to her. And so I just froze. And she ended up getting off at the next stop. And so I had a lot of questions. And I didn't really have anywhere to go to answer them. So I went someplace I hadn't been in 5 years, to church, hoping that I might find some answers there. And so I went to the famous Riverside Church in New York City, and I heard a sermon that Sunday about the Good Samaritan story. Most everybody's heard of the Good Samaritan story, but I hadn't heard it told quite in this way. When Jesus was asked, "Who is your neighbor?" he responded through a story of the Good Samaritan, noting that a Jewish man traveling a dangerous road from Jerusalem to Jericho had been beaten and robbed. And people from his own tradition, a priest, just walked by and ignored him. And then a Levite. Then finally a Samaritan came along. And what I didn't know, and what the minister did such a good job of describing, was to help me realize that Jews and Samaritans hated one another. To one another, they were the despised stranger, the despised foreigner. Yet it was a Samaritan that helped out, and the only one who took care of this despised foreigner, the beaten Jew. And he didn't need to say much more for me to reflect and go, well, how now are you going to relate to the very people that the media and many others are saying are the despised foreigner? Muslims, immigrants, and people of other religions outside of Christianity. And thankfully, that very church had a program of unlikely friendships between Christians and Muslims, Christians and Jews, Christians and Buddhists, Christians and Sikhs. And so all of a sudden, I had the opportunity to be in relationship for the first time in my life with people of other religions. So I started playing soccer with a young man from Nigeria who was Muslim. I started learning languages from a young Pentecostal from Colombia. I started eating food with a Tibetan woman, learning about their food culture. And I was inspired one time to learn of a woman from Somalia and her tradition during Ramadan of fasting throughout the entire longer than a month period, of not eating from sunup to sundown. And I didn't understand that, but after she explained it, why she was doing it, and how it brought about a new respect for food in her life, it made me this year decide to go vegetarian for Lent, which I'm proud to say I am about 14 days into and still going, but I'm dying for a hamburger. I almost got sausage on the pizza last night at Pizza Pit or whatever it was called up the road. We live right now, you and I, in the most religiously diverse country in the world. We arguably live in the most religiously diverse time in human history. We have new diversity compared to 50 years ago. In fact, if you were to ask, even 20 years ago, the majority of the people in Ames, Iowa, or Paradise, Indiana, what was a Muslim, tell me something about Islam, they most likely wouldn't have anything to say. Some of them may not have even known what a Muslim was, or a Sikh. But things have changed. This is a new generation encountering new forms of diversity that we've never touched before. And so I want you to turn right now to somebody next to you and answer this question for one another. Is this new diversity a good thing, or is it a bad thing? I just want you to take 30 seconds to talk about that. All righty. I'd love to hear all of your conversations right now. But what I want to suggest is that diversity can be either a good thing or a bad thing. Diversity is simply a fact that we are living with right now here in Ames, right now here in the United States, right now here in the world. And it can either lead to conflict or cooperation. It's our choice. And so what the Interfaith Youth Corps is attempting to do is to build a new generation of interfaith leaders to make religious pluralism a social norm. Now, I heard when some folks were handing out the flyer for this lecture, when they got the flyer, they were saying, what is religious pluralism? Well, if Kimberly could help me with this. Religious pluralism, as we define it at the Interfaith Youth Corps, is simply engaging, intentionally or proactively engaging in this diversity, not ignoring it, through the lens of interfaith understanding and interfaith cooperation. And there are three parts to building religious pluralism. The first one is respect for religious identity. And religious identity according to the story of the person who's telling you about their religious identity. How many times have you heard somebody say Christians believe without recognizing that there are 2 billion Christians, and I can assure you not all of them believe the same thing. So when we talk about respect for identity, it is for the identity as you yourself describe it through your story. And respect for identity also means, and you can probably see this on campus, say there is a Muslim in your classroom and they want to leave for one of 5 daily prayers, that the faculty member respect the fact that they can leave the classroom to pray. Or if there's a Jewish student who needs to eat certain types of food, that the cafeteria make it possible for those dietary needs that a Jew might have. Number 2 is mutually inspiring relationships. Once you've got it clear, once you've come to the table and learned a little something about another person's religious identity as they define it, you might move that next step into finding yourself maybe a little curious or intrigued about their religious identity to the extent that it makes you wonder a little bit differently about your own. You heard me earlier give my example of just my curiosity around what Muslims do during Ramadan, this fasting. And while I don't necessarily fast during Ramadan, and while I'm not Muslim, and I may not necessarily even agree with all things in that religion, I still admired their persistence in fasting throughout all that time, so that it made me think differently about how seriously I take Lent, which led me to be a vegetarian. This idea of religious pluralism and moving into relationship with somebody of a different religion than you are is not asking you to water down your own religious identity. You can have exclusive truth claims about a religion. You don't need to necessarily agree with every other religion. That's not what religious pluralism is about. It's asking you to come to the table and to hear someone else's story, to respect their religious identity, no matter how much you might disagree with parts of it, to move into relationship with that person and perhaps even be inspired, if that's the case, to think differently and perhaps take your own tradition a little more seriously. And 3, finally, if you're at that stage, perhaps moving into doing service together. Common action for the common good. There are a lot of needs at this university. There are a lot of needs in Ames. You're the experts on this. There are a lot of needs in the world. And one of the folks I was working with today that I was training with, when I asked for an example of this, they lifted up the example of Haiti. Virtually every religious tradition sent some kind of support to Haiti. Now, we may not have heard about it, but Christians of all different denominations and backgrounds were there. Muslims sent the Red Cross there. Buddhists had groups there. Sikhs and Hindus had groups there, all working to help rebuild Haiti and take care of those who were suffering. Why? Because they all have texts in their traditions, or they all have stories in their traditions that believe we should take care of those who are suffering, those who are poor. So it makes sense for those groups to work together. They're going to be better off and can do more working together for the common good, which the world needs right now very badly. And this is particularly important now, at a time when every time you read the morning paper or watch the evening news, what do you see when it comes to religions engaging with one another? Now, before you answer that question, let's show a video that CNN recently put together called God's Warriors, and see if it looks familiar. So does that look familiar? What did that make you feel? You know, I know every time I watch it still, it gets my heart racing quickly. There's a lot of anger, a lot of fear. And it seems like that's the only thing we get when we open the morning paper or we watch the news at night. It affirms the thesis of a well-known author that you might be familiar with, Samuel Huntington, who wrote a famous book called Clash of Civilizations, whose main thesis is that religions in the 21st century are fated to be in conflict with one another. It's one of the most influential political and international relations theory out there. And there are so few stories in the news and in the media that tell an entirely different story. Well, the Interfaith Youth Corps has a different story to tell. That of young people forging relationships based on commonalities in their religions, yet still holding strong to their own religious identity. But if you noticed in that last video, you didn't see any young people talking. You didn't see any cooperation. So this will give you a little bit insight into the work of the Interfaith Youth Corps. Why I think religious pluralism is an urgent issue, as you saw in the title of this lecture, is because right now, in terms of people talking or the media talking about how religions react with one another, right now that space is controlled and dominated by images of conflict, by stories of hatred. It's urgent because right now the folks that are creating some of that hatred and conflict are controlling the space. They're the only stories that are being told. And that's just not the whole story at all. So what I want to ask you all to do right now is to turn with somebody hopefully you don't know. Take a risk to reach out to somebody you don't know. And I want you briefly to take a few minutes to tell your story of religious pluralism, about your encounter with somebody from a different religion. Your story doesn't need to be nearly as dramatic as mine, but simply an encounter or a relationship you had with somebody of a different religion that had some type of positive influence on you. It doesn't mean it necessarily had to change you or your religion. That's not what we're talking about. But that brought you into a deeper understanding of their religion and perhaps a deeper appreciation and a stronger sense of your own faith as a result of doing so. So take a few moments to try and reach out to somebody you don't know and share that story. If you haven't done so yet, go ahead and let the other person share their story. All right, just take about one more minute. All right, if you can again begin to wrap up. And go ahead and make your way back to your seats if you want to. It's cool to see people actually taking that seriously. Oftentimes when you ask people to go talk to somebody they don't know, they'll turn to the person they don't know least in their own group. So I actually really applaud you guys for going out of your way to do that. The reason IFYC begins with stories is because oftentimes when you hear the word interfaith dialogue, groups typically have a tendency to move straight into theological issues that are automatically divisive, that automatically bring up conflict with one another. And hardly any of us are religious experts, myself included. But what we are experts on are our own stories of our own faith or ethical journeys, and our own stories around our engagement with people from different religions. We are experts there. The reason that IFYC is choosing to work in higher education, on colleges and universities, is that we believe colleges and universities should be the leaders in building religious pluralism in the United States, telling the different stories that need to be told. And here are the reasons why. One, because for a lot of students, this is the first place that they encounter significant religious and sometimes cultural diversity. Two is because colleges and universities are often the places where other movements got their starts. Or maybe not were officially started, but got a lot of momentum behind them, like the environmentalist movement, the human rights movement, the multiculturalism movement. Oftentimes they started and had their fuel on college campuses and then filtered down into the rest of society. And three, because of the resources and the energy that university students bring to the table. The difficulty here comes in terms of students' priorities. How much do they want to make building religious pluralism a priority? But that's a different discussion. In talking with the students today here at Iowa State University, and after doing a little research, I recognize that Iowa State takes multiculturalism very seriously. Raise your hand if at some point during your orientation or through an email you've received something about kind of diversity awareness or diversity sensitivity. Yeah, most everybody. Raise your hand if you've received an email or heard a lecture about religious pluralism. Yeah. No, right now does not count. Right, so it should be obvious the differences there. And so the question I want to ask you all is Iowa State prepared for issues of religious identity and all the trickiness that comes with building religious pluralism? Is Iowa State ready to build religious pluralism? And let me give you a couple examples. If, for instance, Hillel all of a sudden was defaced with graffiti, how many students do you think would immediately stand up and say something? How quickly would it take for a reaction to happen on campus? Or let me ask you another question. How many students on Iowa State's campus would be prepared to say something legitimately positive about another religion? Take a moment and discuss that with the person next to you. This is an interactive session. This wasn't just going to be me lecturing all the time. Well, believe me, Columbia's got its own issues. So I'd just be interested real quickly to have a few of you that are brave enough just to very briefly tell me your thoughts, good or bad. I'm not presupposing anything, but I want to know your thoughts from students. Yeah. Go ahead. And yeah. That's awesome. Yep. Appreciate your honesty. Yep. That brings me to my final and closing point before we go into a question and answer period. Beautiful transition, yeah. Go for it.
This was a few years ago. We're named, and my daughter went to Ames High School, and for a senior prom was February Passover. And one of the groups was planning it, did not want to change it. So quite a few students in the high school protested, but the group who had the most power was the Ames Ministerial Association. They're the ones who pushed it. This has to change. This is a lesson we have to take. We have to make a difference here. That was really wonderful support.
That's great. So it sounds like in general, this community has had some experience with this. The campus has had a little bit of experience, but folks are unsure about not quite having the information, not quite knowing what to be sensitive to or what to have respect for. Or even if folks would stand up, my question is, do you have a coordinating body to make sure that folks can speak from one voice? That's kind of where I want to end. One thing I recognized about this university is when I've come and I've had very little time here, but I have absolutely been inspired by the students I worked with today who do feel very passionate about building religious pluralism on campus and generally felt very positive about the open-mindedness and the compassionate nature of students here, regardless of their religious affiliation. At the same time, they noted some of the past issues with Memorial Chapel, and a lot of folks apparently have heard about that. And so they showed it to me this morning, and when I walked in, I saw a place that didn't even look too much like a chapel. There was a curtain going all the way across one of the main parts of the religious space there, covering up a cross and a window with Jewish symbols on it. And that for me was very revealing, as though the campus, and I'm not sure if this is the case or not, I'm just telling you what my impression was, that the campus was kind of putting a curtain or hiding, talking about this issue, or really engaging in this issue. And that seemed to really resonate with some of the folks that are leading or that want to be leaders in this new interfaith council that is trying to be formed. And apparently they sent emails out to about all 40 of the different religious groups that were out there, and only about 3 responded. They noted that hardly any of them are talking to one another. So it seems like there is a great spirit, there is great energy, and there are tremendous opportunities right now for this campus to engage in religious pluralism, something that a lot of campuses aren't doing, and something that the media is hungry for, that other colleges are hungry for in terms of this example. I asked them to write the story about the chapel and about what they plan on doing, and I guaranteed them that we'd be putting that on the front page of our website. And I'd let our founder, Ibu Patel, know about it, and even potentially write about it in the Washington Post blog that he has every week. This is a unique thing. So one, I would encourage you all to take time to fill out the blue forms on your chair to get involved with this council, or to get involved with the Interfaith Youth Corps and the movement that it's building, and there's more materials in the back. So I would encourage you to check those out and leave your name with me on one of those forms so we can build you into the larger community on a website called Bridge Builders. And 2, I just want you to think yourself a little bit more about how you individually can begin to build religious pluralism. Whether it means taking the courage to reach out to somebody who you know might be of a different religion than you, having the courage perhaps to ask questions. Reflect on your own tradition. What is it in your own tradition that talks to you about how you should relate to people from different religions? Find that out. Look in your own tradition, be it religious or ethical, about how you're to relate to people of different religions. And to tell your story, so that the stories you see on the evening news right now aren't the only stories that are being told. And again, if I haven't said it before, to definitely get in touch with Kimberly or other folks that are putting together this Interfaith Council, so that when something may arise on campus, you're going to be prepared for it, you're going to have a coordinated response, and Iowa State University is going to be all the better for it. And you coming out of Iowa State are going to be all the more prepared to be a responsible religious or ethical person in this world as a result of having gone here. So I want to end there by thanking you all for allowing me to talk and ask if there are any questions, and to use that microphone if you can and turn it on. Thanks. I should know, just while you're thinking of the perfect question, I'll also provide these. IFYC has put together a group of 6 hallmarks, ways in which we think folks can begin to build religious pluralism on their campus. And let me just read those for you real quickly before he begins with his question. Number 1 is that the campus prioritizes religious pluralism as an institutional value and dedicates leadership, staff, and funding to that value. 2 is that students lead religious pluralism activities, and the university devotes resources to building up students' interfaith leaders. 3, that the campus is a safe space for both religious and non-religious students, and students are empowered to address issues of religious identity and sensitivity. 4, that the campus encourages the academic exploration of religious pluralism across disciplines. 5, that religious pluralism is integrated into student life from extracurricular programming to orientation and residence life. And 6, finally, that large numbers of students regularly participate in interfaith action projects to address local and global needs. So I'll end there, and hopefully that sparks some ideas in your head about how to actually make this a reality on Iowa State's campus. Please. Yeah, you may just have to speak up, and I'll repeat the question. Thanks. I think that's just a wonderful question. And my hope is that through being in conversation with other people, it's going to inspire them to figure out a little bit more about their own tradition. One of the striking things for me when I first joined the Interfaith Youth Corps was the founder, Eboo Patel, began quoting Christians. He's a Muslim, one of the strongest young Muslim leaders out there, and he began quoting biblical scripture right and left. Stuff I didn't even know in some cases existed, and I'm a Christian minister. So it's like, oh man, I better learn my stuff a little bit better. So that my hope is just that folks don't need to feel like they got to be experts on their own tradition before they enter into, but that they'll be inspired through talking to different people to find out more about their tradition. I think you're making a great point. Yeah.
Hi, we're all from Simpson College, actually, which you've probably never heard of, but okay, good. Sorry. My question to you is if you have any practical advice for a group of students who are looking to kind of engage in an interfaith dialogue at a school that's predominantly white and predominantly Christian. There's a lot more diversity here in Ames at ISU, and so we're trying to look at this from a little bit different perspective. So if you have any advice, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Well, one, I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. And I heard that from quite a few universities that are predominantly white or predominantly Christian. And that's a tough one sometimes to tackle. One, I still think it's worth going after because you're leaving school regardless. Two, there is untapped diversity, be it through international students or just students that get lost in the mix. So to really know where to look. 3 is that in your surrounding community, there may be untapped immigrant communities or religious communities that you just haven't gone to. So maybe visiting those places and perhaps bringing speakers in to speak to you about religious difference. So those are just some ideas that come to mind. And I would also encourage you to be in touch with a few other universities in Iowa that I know are beginning to take religious pluralism seriously, building interfaith councils. That's this university, who's just starting out, so I would definitely encourage you guys to talk to one another. Luther College, who's really starting to make a financial commitment and resource commitment to this, and Iowa Wesleyan University, who's beginning to tackle this a little bit as well. So let's talk more after this, because I know that's a challenge, but it's not one that can't be overcome. Other questions or thoughts?
I don't have a question, but I have an announcement to make. We're having our first interfaith service project this Saturday, and we're making blankets for Linus Project, and they're going to go to children suffering illnesses. And we'll be in room 3630 of the Memorial Union here, and it's from 10 to 2, and you can come at any time. Do you have to sew? No, you do not have to be able to sew to come. If you can tie a knot, you can make a blanket.
That's great. I'd be glad to share with anybody that would like this resource. We have a resource on a sheet of paper of about 9 different religious traditions and text from each one of those traditions talking about the value of service. and all of them are inspirational. This is a place where there's very clearly some shared values between religious traditions, and they ought to be coming together instead of working separately to do service in the community. Imagine what that would look like and how much the media up here would eat that up, those unlikely friendships, all of a sudden that are forming of different religions acting together to do something like this. That would be a beautiful thing. So I'm glad you announced that. Would encourage everybody to do that service.
My question is about those who are non-religious. How do interfaith communities or religions deal with those who are non-religious or atheist?
Well, if you notice, and I may not have done this particularly well, but I made sure in my comments to try to include ethical, philosophical, and religious perspectives. One of the great things I discovered about this university is the folks that seem to care the most about the chapel situation was the Atheist Agnostic Society or Association here on campus. So I would definitely encourage you to get in touch with the interfaith group here and ask them why did they care to get involved in this. And I think on the one hand, it's because they themselves come from, many of them, a secular humanist tradition that in itself has great sayings and traditions of moral and philosophical belief about serving others and about even religious freedom, and that includes their own ethical freedom. And because they themselves recognize, and it's not an us-them sort of thing, but a lot of secular humanists that I've talked to still recognize that they live in the world with a lot of religions right now that seem to be beating up one another, and when they're not doing that, they seem to be oppressing those who don't believe, and recognize that they got to be a part of this conversation too, and that their moral and ethical claims are just as important as any other religious tradition, and may help you to reflect a little bit differently on your own religious tradition. So they're just as welcome and just as important to this conversation as anybody else. And obviously in the case of Iowa State, we're the ones that seem to yell out the rallying cry, which is a beautiful example. Any other questions or comments? Cool. Well, I really hope that, especially for those who are required to come, this was time well spent. I hope that you've started to think about maybe taking that step into relationship with people from other traditions, about growing stronger in your own tradition and actually helping to build religious pluralism on campus and serving your community to make it a better place. I'm more than happy to stick around and answer questions. And I, again, really thank you for this opportunity to speak with you and hope you had a good time. So thank you.